Okay. All right, here we go. 5, 4. Welcome to our study on the book of Romans. This is Sonship Establishment Part 4, and today we'll be discussing lessons 19 to 22. In Romans 9, 10, and 11, we've been in the fourth section of our establishment as sons. And Paul is informing us about the setting aside of Israel's program, the reality of God establishing a dispensation of Gentile grace, and we're supposed to be able to perceive some things from that actually end our establishment and get us ready for the education itself. And so we've been in this second section of chapter 11. Remember, we divided it into 3 parts. First one is verses 1 through 10, where we looked at Israel's present state. Verses 11 to 29, where we see Israel's future state. Verses 30 to 36, which is how we're supposed to view all that, the perspective that we're supposed to have, how that's supposed to impact us. And there's some really, well, anyway, we'll get to that. So if you'll turn in your Bibles to Romans chapter 11, and I'll give Trent some time. The PowerPoint, he's looking through a plethora of flash drives to try to get that. Romans chapter 11. And look with me here, starting in, as a matter of fact, I know that we kind of went through some things, so look in verse 16. I know we covered this. For if the first fruits be holy, the lump is also holy. If the root be holy, so are the branches. And if some of the branches be broken off, and thou, being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and with them partakers of the root and fatness of the olive tree, boast not against the branches. And we talked about that. But if thou boast, thou bearest not the root, but the root thee. Thou wilt say then, the branches were broken off, that I might be grafted in. And this is the verse that I really want to focus on. So let me just kind of put these up here so we can refer back to them. In verse 19, Israel was broken off because of unbelief. Then in verse 20, because of unbelief they were broken off, and thou standest by faith. And then in verse 20, he ends this with an admonition of, be not high-minded, but fear. And we're going to talk about what that fear is. And then verse 21, for if God spared not the natural branches, take heed, lest he also spare not thee. So verse 21, there is another warning there to take heed. And we're going to do some work with that. And then in verse 22, that'll end this first section we're going to look at. Behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God on them which fell severity, but toward thee goodness, if thou continue in his goodness, otherwise thou also shalt be cut off. Now, that section, let me put it up here, verse 22, contains an if clause that I take to be conditional. If thou continue in his goodness. And you remember we talked about that olive tree being the tree of God's goodness, the tree of God's working. The tree wasn't Israel. The tree was the tree of God's, we could call it goodness, his working, his grace, his mercy. We actually see that word show up in this passage. It would be right on target. And Israel was in that as the natural branches because they've always been in the tree of God's working. From the time of their creation, they've been in a special place with God. When God broke that program off and put us in, he didn't graft us into Israel, he grafted us into the tree of his goodness. That makes sense to everybody. Just kind of refreshing us into where we were. Now, with that thought in mind, he's going to come along in 19 and say, well, because of unbelief, they were broken off. And that would be true. In verse 20, he gives us a warning. Don't get high-minded like you were so great, God grafted you in, and they were so bad. We weren't any better off. What were we? We're in that little wild olive tree, and we were worshiping every god in the world except the true God. And then in verse 21, he tells us, take heed lest thou also be cut off. And then in verse 22, he gives us the condition that governs that. And he says, behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God. On them which fell, which is Israel, severity. But on thee, goodness. And then there's a colon right there, which means you're not through. And he says, And it says, on thee goodness, if thou continue in his goodness. Now, there are only two ways to look at this, and I think we have to get it right. And I'll show you the way this is normally taught. I'll show you, well, I'm talking about within the parameters of sonship. Outside of that, there's probably 30 ways that this gets taught. Now, I'm not going to address those. But we're going to go down a different path today. But you'll see why, because I believe what is sitting in these passages is something that absolutely changes the way you look at the dispensation of grace. And I believe we're supposed to be impacted like that, and we're supposed to look at it differently. And it's a glorious thing. As a matter of fact, this constituted probably one of the most exciting studies we've ever had in Monahans down there. I mean, they just talked about it all through the break and on after the service. And so I'm hoping that it's going to make the same kind of impact with us. And so this is what I want to show you. So if you look at verse 22, let's examine that verse a little bit. Behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God. On them which fell, severity. And you understand why it was severity. They're no longer in a favored nation status. They've been made a curse from Christ. They've been blinded. Remember, they stumbled that they should fall. They've been blinded. You understand, that's what he's talking about with severity. And he says, but toward thee, goodness, comma, if thou continue in his goodness, otherwise thou also shalt be cut off. So isn't that a bit of a warning? Now there's only, like I said, there's only two ways to take this, and I'm going to kind of condense them down. The first way, and the way this gets taught, is that if thou continue in his goodness, well, let me just take it back from that previous colon, after severity. But toward thee goodness, if thou continue in his goodness, otherwise thou also shalt be cut off. All that's saying, and this first way of saying it is, you have been grafted into this tree of God's goodness, and you will continue in that goodness for as long as God gives you his goodness. When God has decided he won't give you his goodness anymore, you'll also be cut off. And that's what that is taught. I'm not disagreeing with that statement, because I believe that statement goes without saying. You're going to continue in the goodness of God for as long as God continues to give you his goodness. Who didn't know that? Now, when this gets taught, and again, I'm not throwing anybody under the bus. You know what? Sons get to teach this the way they want to teach it. But if I'm not convinced of it, I have to say it the way, and so you'll make your own decision about this, and that's fine with me. I can live with that. But was that a no? Okay.
No, well, I'm just saying, if he gives us grace, he's going to continue to give us goodness.
That's exactly right. And they're going to say, here's what this is really teaching you, that you won't always be the recipients of this goodness. Eventually the program will be broken off. But I've listed in your notes 5 ways, I think, that you already knew that by the time you got to verse 22. Remember, prior to this, at the very first, hath God cast away his people? God forbid. What was that? A permanent casting away. What was that other one? You know, if the fall of them be the riches of the world, and the diminishing of them be the riches of the Gentiles, how much more there what? Fullness. So we knew there was still going to be a fullness. Remember? And then later he says, and if the casting away of them be the riches of the world, well, you know, what shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead? I mean, you already knew, didn't you, that this wasn't going to be a permanent situation. I don't think he's coming along and saying, well, you're going to get God's goodness for as long as he continues to give you his goodness. Of course. It's almost like when someone walks out the door and says, do I need to put gas in the car? And here's the answer you get. Well, you'll continue to have gas for as long as there's gas in the car. Well, didn't you already know that? And by the way, here's the other thing to look at in verse 22. And toward thee goodness, if thou, that puts the onus on us. It didn't say if God continues to give you goodness. It says if thou continue in his goodness. I understand how you could read it that way. So what this is saying is there is no external factor that God is looking at to decide whether or not he is going to continue the dispensation of grace. If you believe that and you teach that, then what you're saying is, and it's true, there's no signs That's true. But what you're really teaching is this, is that at any moment, God can come along and bring to a complete close the dispensation of grace. We're all done. And that means at every moment of every day, you are living on the brink of the end of the dispensation of grace as far as you know. Now, I don't really have a problem with us not knowing when the dispensation of grace will end. We've talked about that forever, of when we've made fun of all those folks that have set dates for the rapture and all that. But let me show you where this leads. Hold your place there and go to Romans chapter 13. Because in Romans chapter 13, that understanding of Romans chapter 11, verse 22, leads this verse to be taught this way. Romans chapter 13, and look with me at verse 11. And that knowing the time, and here's how that starts. And knowing the time, in other words, knowing that you don't have the promise of the next 2 minutes, and that knowing the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep, for now is our salvation nearer than when we believed. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. And here's how verse 12 gets taught. That's the day of the Lord. So if you believe that, what you're saying is, hey, the day of the Lord is at hand every moment. Because if God cuts this thing off, what's the next thing on the timetable? The day of the Lord. Now see, if that's right, then I could see that. But I don't believe that the day here is referring to the day of the Lord. And I'm not going to teach it to you that way. And I'll just show you why, and we'll cover it when we actually get over there. But first of all, back up from that word day. The night is far spent. Since when did Paul refer to the dispensation of grace as the night? He didn't. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Look in the next verse. Let us walk honestly as in the day. We're supposed to walk like we're in the day of the Lord? Come on. That is not right. You know, that's back in Israel's program, isn't it? So that's not what that is. I'm convinced that's not what that is. And so I'm not going to teach it that way. I do think there's something in here much richer than that. But that, you know what? Maybe I'm wrong. So you know what? I'm giving you both ways to look at it. You can make your own decision. I haven't misrepresented what that is. There's no external factor that God is looking at. But let me ask you a question. When He broke off His program with Israel, why did He do it? Because of unbelief. In other words, was God looking at something that made Him decide to do something Himself? Yes. Yes. And if I'm reading verse 22 right, and toward thee goodness, if, there's the condition, if thou continue in His goodness. So that means we have to understand, what does it mean to continue in His goodness? What does that mean? And I don't think it means just to continue to get His goodness. I think there's more sitting there than that. I think what he's talking about is you are going to continue in that which God's goodness was meant to accomplish in this dispensation of grace. And that's not just salvation. Because really, salvation is not the end. In the old days, I thought the end of it all was just get them saved, right? And they're going to heaven. But now we find out in sonship that the reason God saved you, Galatians 2, is so that we might what? Receive the adoption of sons. Do you remember we went through that? In other words, in order to deal with you as sons, He had to justify you and sanctify you before He could educate you as a son who would labor with Him in His business. And that's the final goal. To get you, to have His wisdom instilled in us so that we are capable of laboring with Him up there. It's not enough to just get saved. Salvation is a means to an end, not an end, right? And so if that's true, then then the dispensation of grace is dependent. It's dependent upon us continuing in that goodness. And to me, in the context of this, because Who has Paul been talking about since Romans 8:14? Sons who have made the cry of Abba, Father, who are now involved in their sonship establishment, who are now, about to enter into the education. And you know what I think he's saying here is, and you'll continue to get that goodness for as long as you continue in that goodness. Otherwise, I'm quoting the verse here, otherwise thou shalt be cut off. I don't want to put any pressure on you, but I'm going to tell you what I'm about to show you. The continuance of the dispensation of grace is on our shoulders. And I'm not talking about everybody that's saved. I'm talking about sons and daughters. Sons and daughters. Those are the ones. By the way, if you say, well, in other words, if God, and somebody said this out in West Texas, well, then if the policy of evil manages to shut down sonship everywhere, that'll be the end of the dispensation of grace. That would be a true statement. But I don't think it's going to have to be shut down totally everywhere. I'll just tell you why. Because when God shut down Israel's program because of unbelief, wasn't there still a believing remnant? Yes, there was. And He still broke that program off. What we don't know is, how low does the tank need to get before God says, I'm shutting the engine off? Now, why would God do it that way? And again, your notes will do a much better organized job of this, because I'm kind of like a jackrabbit jumping around on this thing. But what I want to get in your mind is this. Think of it this way. We have a store. And you know what? When our store was open, we had a product that was hot, 8 tracks. And we were selling those 8 tracks. Don't look at me like you don't know what those are. Everybody in this room knows what those are. And you got 8 tracks. And man, we're selling them like hotcakes. But you know what? Then something else came along, cassette tapes. And you know what? That really put a pinch on our business. And if we kept the store open long enough, guess what? Then CDs came along. And now cassettes were hurting. And you know what? How many people are coming into our store to buy 8 tracks? Okay, not very many. Okay, there you go. Okay, go back to the old vinyl. That's exactly right. Here's my point. You might have a few people that come in for the sake of a collection, but do you really have enough business to keep the doors open? And I think that's what God is saying about continuing in His goodness. There's something I'm trying to do in this dispensation of grace. What is He trying to do in the dispensation of grace? He's trying to get sons and daughters educated to labor with Him in His business. And if nobody's coming into, excuse the way I'm illustrating it, if nobody's coming into that store for that product, the store owner has every right now to say, you know what? We need to close the doors. Or maybe we need a different product. So you take the dispensation of grace product off the shelf, and guess what He puts on there in its place? The Israel product. And now we go right back into Israel's program. I know that's kind of a crazy way to illustrate it, but because it's grace, because it is grace, and think about it this way. Let's just do a progression. How many people did Jesus die for on the cross? Why did He die for everybody? Okay, because everybody needed it. How many did He want to be saved? All of them. The Bible's plain about that. And if they all got saved, how many of them received justification? And of those that got saved, how many of them received sanctification? Then how many of them, whether they knew it or not, were made to be sons? All. And so if they're all made to be sons, how many did God really want to be educated as His sons and daughters? All. So let me ask you, does it make sense then, if you've plainly declared that this is what you want for everyone, if we're in the midst of doing this, that God would come along for no external reason whatsoever and just say, I think I'll just cut this thing off? Because doesn't that run contrary to what He's already declared He wants? See, that doesn't even make sense to me. Because if this, well, let me ask you this. How pleased do you think God is when there's finally a group that understands this thing about sonship, and now they're involved in it and they're moving along? Do you think He's glad of that? Are you kidding? This is why He did this whole thing with His Son. And you think now that it's going, He goes, wow, look at that take off. Yeah, let's close it down. For no reason. Just arbitrarily. So my point is this. I don't think God is moving arbitrarily. In fact, when I look back in the Bible, not just in Israel's program, but even before Israel's program, everything God did was in response to something that happened. Go back to the Tower of Babel. Did He just confound the languages and scatter the people because one day He just said, yeah, I just think I'll do that. I don't really have any reason for it. Did He drive them out of the garden for no reason? I just said, you know what, time's up, get out. He's responding to things, right? And here's what I think verse 22 is telling us. Here's the response. If thou continue in His goodness. Otherwise, in other words, if you don't want to continue in His goodness, you'll be cut off. And I'm going to tell you, there will come a day when this will be cut off. Now you say, well, how do you know? Listen, how long has this thing run? 2,000 years. Now, by the way, if I'm right about verse 22, do you know what that means? The word continue. I had it in the notes. I went back and did the definition thing and looked at all of that. But you know what continue means? It means without interruption. So if I'm right about what verse 22 is saying, that from what started with Paul has continued to us, that someone, somewhere, has continued in what he was doing in the dispensation of grace. Do we know who they are? No. No. You know, we never heard about them, but I'll guarantee you this. If we didn't have the web today, do you know how many folks would know about us? Not very many. Not very many. Might be a few folks you've talked to that have already decided you're in a cult. Other than that, not very many. But just carry it back to where you didn't even have communication the way we have it. I mean, it would be real easy to carry on sonship with a group and nobody on the other side of the country know anything about that whatsoever. But if I'm right, then this has continued on. But there will come a day when that will shut down. And I don't want to get bogged down in trying to guess on how close it came and all that kind of business. But He did not break Israel off arbitrarily, and He's not going to arbitrarily interrupt the dispensation of grace. Now, here's the thing I want you to look back in. Let's talk about that fear aspect. Look back with me now, Romans chapter 11. I'm looking at verse, Trent, if you can give it to me. I'm looking at verses 20 and 21. Okay, well, because of unbelief they were broken off, and thou standest by faith. Be not high-minded, but fear. Can you find 21 for me? It should be right along in there somewhere, but I know it's not in the order that I'm doing it. If you find it, throw it up there. If not, look in your Bibles, chapter 11, verse 21. For if God spared not the natural branches, take heed lest He also spare not thee. And that word right there, that was the critical word. Now, I just went back to my crab synonyms, and I looked that word up. When I went through it the first time, I didn't do that because I thought, I know what that means, to take heed. What do you think it means? Yeah, to pay attention. Right. That's exactly what I thought. And that's not a bad synonym. But you know what he didn't say? There's another synonym. Instead of saying, if someone's doing something, instead of saying take heed, you might say take, who said it? Care. Take care. But he didn't say that, and I thought it was interesting because that's the two words that Krabs brought up. Let me just read it to you. Heed means, it says heed applies to matters of importance to one's moral character. Care is solicitude, which is attention or concern to matters of minor import. A man, this is great, a man is required to take heed, a child is required to take care. And then he says, I'm going to skip down because of time here. Heed looks to the probable consequences of his actions and endeavors to prevent the evil that may happen, while care sees principally to the thing that is immediately before him. So heed says, I'm looking down the road at probable consequences, and the heed is so that I can avoid those consequences of my actions. But care has to do with something that's immediately before you. And the illustration he gave was, a man has to take heed that his company, the company he keeps, does not corrupt him. But when he's walking on an icy walk, he takes care not to slip. That's the thing that's immediately before him. But when you're talking about taking heed, then you're talking about actions, being careful about actions that have probable consequences in the future that you want to avoid. So, if you look back at verse 22, what are we supposed to take heed about? Because heed is, let me just say it again here, looks to the probable consequences of his actions and endeavors to prevent the evil that may happen. So what are we supposed to take heed to? Yeah, to continue in his goodness. If there's no action on our part, I mean, by the way, if God's going to arbitrarily cut it off, why do you need to take heed at all? That doesn't make sense either. I mean, by the way, that's not very motivating. So this one is, there is an external factor, and that external factor is if we continue in his goodness. If we don't, look, if nobody's coming into the store, why keep the store open? Yes, it's grace, but if no one's appropriating that grace for the purpose for which it was given, then God is not unjust in shutting that program down. He's exhausted. There's another term sitting in here that's going to amplify on what we've just talked about. We'll get over there. It's called, when he talks about the fullness of the Gentiles. And we'll talk about that term in just a moment. But look, let's go back to, look back with me, verse 20. Well, because of unbelief, they were broken off, and thou standest by faith. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Be not high-minded, but fear. So I got to thinking, what in the world are we supposed to fear? And as I was going through this, what are we supposed to take heed to? Because fear does not describe the kind of relationship that we have with our Father. Fear was a part of Israel's relationship with God under the law. So what is it we're... In fact, you know what? Even Paul's going to write to Timothy, we have not been given the spirit of fear, but of power and love and a sound mind. So what in the world are we supposed to fear? And I thought, as I looked through this, and again, I'm just kind of shortening all this up, but I found two things that I thought that we really needed to fear. And now, if you're teaching it from this standpoint, here's what you have to say. Be not high-minded, but fear, because you also may be cut off. And so you need to be afraid that God's going to shut off the dispensation of grace. Now, that's the way that gets taught. And I got to thinking about that, and I thought, well, then something's wrong with me because I'm really not afraid of the rapture. Are you? Is that the way God taught you to look at the blessed hope? Oh, I sure hope it doesn't happen today. Okay. Now, you may have ideas about, I would love for it to happen, or I'd like to hold off a little longer so I can get my education, but all of that kind of business. But let me ask you a question. Just think about this. What is going to happen with you if the dispensation of grace ended right now, if the first way of looking at this is right, and God cut this thing off right here, bang, and the dead in Christ rise first, and then we are caught together with them, meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever, in the clouds, so shall we ever be with the Lord. What has happened to you? We didn't finish our course. Well, you didn't finish your course. All right. What else? What's taking place for you? You get a glorified body. What else do you get? You get an inheritance. What else? Okay. We're going to be put in our position. Boo said, rule and reign. We're going to be put in positions of authority in the heavenly places, right? Who are you going to go be with? You're going to go be with the Lord, aren't you? Are any of those things you fear? Now, what's the worst thing, and Tommy said it right off the bat, what's the worst thing about going right now? You didn't become a fully educated son, right? But does your father talk to you about that issue like that's something you're supposed to fear? I mean, if it happens right now, do you have any idea how glorious it's going to be for us anyway? I mean, no, we won't be fully educated sons, but we're not going to be uneducated either. And because of that, we not only get that heir of God inheritance, which everyone gets just simply for being a believer, but you get that joint heir inheritance. Joint heir because there's something you're doing with Christ. Joint heirs with Christ. Now look, here's my point. None of that is characterized by fear. So when he said, be not high-minded but fear, and in the next one, take heed lest thou also be cut off, I thought, what in the world, what are we taking heed to? Where does the fear come in? Because none of those things are things that I quake in my boots over. So here's the two things. The first one is for others who have not yet come to Christ. Do you know what has happened here? Let me take you to Romans 11. I'm going to skip you down to the bottom. This will save us time later. Look down in verse 30. Verse 30. For as ye, talking about us Gentiles, for as ye in times past have not believed God. That's true. In the time past part of Israel's program, we were not believers in God. Yet now have obtained mercy through their unbelief. Do you see what he's saying? Because they unbelieve and God broke their program off, and now he allowed us to be grafted into the tree of his goodness and get his cultivating hand of goodness and working and grace and mercy. We have received mercy because of their unbelief. Verse 31. Even so have these also now not believed, that through your mercy they also may obtain mercy. Now look, when I was writing this, here's what I was writing. I was writing back up here, and I said, okay, because of unbelief they were broken off. And I wrote this. I typed this in the notes. Israel deserved to be broken off because of their unbelief. And then I thought for a minute, I went, no, that's wrong. That's wrong. That's not what they deserved. What did they deserve? They deserved the day of wrath. That was the next thing to come. That's what they were worthy of. Why are they not? Why did breaking them off? Why does Paul now describe that even though the nations, look, don't look at this as individual Jews. Look at it as the program that God was working with Israel. That's what got broken off. That's what made them a curse from Christ. That's what reduced them down to the level of Gentiles. But you know what? That was a mercy. How? Because a Jew that had rejected Jesus' earthly ministry and rejected the apostles' ministry under the Holy Ghost in the first 7 chapters of Acts could have come along later and heard Paul preach, and could they have gotten saved? And that would be a mercy. And because God extended mercy to not just us Gentiles, but the body of Christ can be made up of both Jew and Greek. And now they've got mercy again. Do you see? And God was doing them a favor. You could get uppity and go, oh, you broke our program off. You don't have any right. God said, I'm giving you another shot at mercy. So we'll look at go back to verse 31. Even so have these also now not believed, that through your mercy they also might obtain mercy. For God hath concluded them all in unbelief, that he might have mercy upon all. No wonder he calls this the time of long suffering and mercy and grace and forbearance. Do you see that? Now, let me take that back up and say this. That's why I say for others. Because what's going to happen to you as sons and daughters is not something you're going to fear. I mean, as bad as we want to be educated, when this thing is over, you are not going to be walking around heaven pouting with your lip poked out, kicking dust. and mad, waiting for somebody to come up and say, what's wrong? Say, well, I just can't believe the Lord did that. It's going to be hallelujah. It will. But now, my point is, but the opportunity for Gentiles at large, the program that allows God's goodness to be bestowed not only upon Gentiles, but also Jews, all of that's going to be over. And do you know what happens to Gentiles when that's over and He puts the natural branches back in? First of all, Israel now gets their special place of privilege back again. And He is working with them. Do you know what happens to the Gentiles? They get reconsigned back over to the adversary. And they're back in darkness. And you know what that means? They'll be worshiping every god in the world except the true God. That's what I think the first part of the fear is about. This opportunity of mercy is going to be pulled. But here's the second part that I think that we have to fear and take heed to continue in His goodness about. Because it's not just for others to continue to have the opportunity for God's mercy, but it is also for this dispensation of grace to continue. Now, you may think that sounds far-fetched. You may say, oh, look, I don't think that's what it's about. Why would God, well, let me ask it sarcastically, because I love sarcasm. Why would God ever want you to have a part of what He was doing and was depending on you to do your job in order for His glory to be made manifest? How ridiculous. Isn't that what He's training us to do? When you get into the heavenly places, are you really going to be counted on to labor with Him? Or is that just kind of a superficial title, and it really doesn't matter if you have any sonship skills or not? If you blow it, don't worry, He'll just come along and fix it, because you don't really impact the success of what He's doing one bit. Not really. Because it's all just labels and facade and veneers, but there's no real substance to it. Or do we have a real job that has real meaning that He is really counting on us to do in eternity? Yes or no? Yes. Well, if that's true, then you know what? We already know that He is going to be counting on us to do the position He puts us in. Yes? And if we're going to be counted on to do that, is there anything on our shoulders with regard to that? Do we really have responsibility? Has anybody found a plan B in the Bible that if the body of Christ fumbles the ball, God says, don't worry about it, because what you guys were doing really didn't affect the success or failure of what I'm doing anyway. Don't worry about it. I've got a plan B. If you fumble the ball, I'd already called timeout on the sideline, so it wasn't really a fumble. Don't worry about it. Did anybody find another way that God's going to get that done? Or did He just say, I'm going to put this in the hands of my sons and daughters? It's in our hands. It's the only thing that will glorify Him. Remember, He wants to look down there and go, that's my son. That's my son. Now, if we are already on this earth going to be given an education in godly decision-making skills, are we not supposed to, through the daily events of our life, find the ways to put those skills into practice and hone and sharpen and refine those skills? Yes. Well, let me ask you, don't you see that as long as we continue in His goodness, then we bear the responsibility of continuing the program that He put in the hands of the Apostle Paul. And you know what that means? Every single one of us impacts the continuance of this dispensation of grace. You can't look at this and say, well, that group's going to continue to do it. I'm just going to kind of phase out. There was a believing remnant when He broke off Israel's program. And there may be a few places around doing something, but you understand, you are an important part of this. Your continuance, and now I have to say a word about this. You can't just go through the motions with it, because that won't work. You can't just say, well, you know what, I'm just going to show up to the study and, okay, he'll keep the doors open. He knows if this is really happening or not. This has got to be real. This has got to be something that's really taking place in us, that we're really continuing in His goodness. Because if we're not, then there's no reason to continue to do this. So there's I'm not trying to bum you out with this. This is a great responsibility from our Father. But I see it as a fearful responsibility. In that way, I'm talking about fearful. And when He's talking about lest thou also be broken off, He said, because when I break this off, mercy extended to the world is over. Now we're going to see a time of trouble, the like of which the world has never seen. That's kind of a fearful thing. Not that you're going to be involved in it, but that mercy is no longer being offered to the world. And the other thing is, this dispensation of grace, this thing that I was doing for the first time, for the very first time that I was able to take men and make sons and daughters who were qualified to labor with me, I put that in your hands to continue that thing, and let's see this done unto my glory as you work within my plan and purpose. And if that dies on our watch, I think that's a fearful thing. Proverbs 1:7. This fits right in with something you've already been told. Remember we were back in Proverbs looking at the table of contents in those first 6 verses? And then they started the exhortations, and I realized these were the exhortations in Israel's program. Many of those exhortations were interdispensational. We didn't look at their doctrine at all, but I want you to look back at verse 7, if I'm remembering this correctly, because where we are in the notes, I have no idea. Verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Somebody tell me, now that's the fear of the Lord, and we talked about that wasn't like, oh, I'm afraid of what God's going to do to me. But there was another fear. What was the son fearing? What was the fear of the Lord? Okay, failure, but it was failure in not what he was doing, but how he was being perceived by his father. The fear is my father, I don't want my father to look at me as though I'm a fool. Look at the last part of the verse. But fools despise wisdom and instruction. What did we cover? When we covered this, what did we talk about the word despise means? It means to count it as of no value. In other words, if a son looks at this sonship curriculum and says, that's no big deal, he does not value and esteem it like his father does. And then his father considers that son to be a foolish son. And the fear is, I don't want my father to perceive me as a fool. I want to look at this the very way my father looks at it. And when he thinks it's this big of a deal, I'm going to think it's this big of a deal. Because I want to be educated of my father. I went back to here and saw that fear of the Lord. And when he says, be not high-minded, but fear, look, if we don't count this thing important enough that God can continue it on, we will have been foolish sons. Does that make any sense? Is this pulling together at all? I know it's kind of hodgepodge. What I got left here? Just a couple minutes. Let me get on over here because I need to... By the way, if God is just going to cut this thing off and just say, hey, but based on no factor whatsoever, I could cut this any time. So be afraid that God is just going to cut this off at any moment. All right? So here...
Could it be an aspect, too, that part of the warning is that, look, just like Israel thought their program would never be cut off and it would just continue on, don't think that, like they did, that our program can't be cut off, too.
There is an aspect of that. There is. Yeah, there certainly is. But here's the other thing I think about this. Yeah, and by the way, and that's why the warning, because if you don't continue, that's what will happen to you.
like they thought.
Exactly. Now, if you're looking up here and saying, I'm just fearful every day that this is going to be the end of the dispensation of grace, wouldn't Paul also, and if the reason was because you didn't finish your sonship education, then wouldn't Paul also have to tell you to fear death? Because if you die today, guess what? Your sonship education is over. Is that how you find Paul talking about death? Okay, so I got this little Philippians thing for you. Philippians 1:20. Philippians 1:20. According to my earnest expectation and my hope that in nothing I shall be ashamed, but that with all boldness as always, so now also Christ shall be magnified in my body, whether it be by life or by death. For me to live is Christ, but to die is gain. But if I live in the flesh, this is the fruit of my labor, yet what I shall choose I want not, for I am in a strait betwixt two, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. And then look at this last part. Nevertheless, to abide in the flesh is more needful for you. Why was it more needful? Paul said, you really need me to stay around, and that's really what's going to guide my thinking here. By the way, you know what that decision-making skill is? Out of godly equity. It's about esteeming others more than yourself. And Paul says, look, I have a desire to go and be with Christ, which is far better. I would love to go do that, but it's more needful for me to be here with you. Do you see that? But he doesn't talk about death like, oh, this is going to be the end of it. Look at that next verse, 25. I love this. And having this confidence that I shall abide and continue with you. Funny, he used that very word that we just saw in Romans chapter 11. He's going to be continuing with... Do you think that Paul was responsible for very much of the dispensation of grace? Going along? Okay, now he's not here now. You know who's here? We are. We are. So, what God put into the hands of Paul... And by the way, if he was going to run it without anybody, when Paul got stoned at Lystra, why send him back? God has decided how we wanted to get this done. He's going to get it done through sons and daughters. And that's us. Okay, let's see. Let's see if there's one more thing I want to say to you before we bring this first session to a close. I really need you to read the notes and make sure that you see this whole thing. Oh, it's the timer. I guess we're done. I got cut off. I wasn't fast enough. I know. I
Mine doesn't make that much noise.
I have a question.
Okay.
And maybe this might pertain to a lot of people, not just me, but you've given us a lot of information over the last, year and a half or however long we've been studying this. What if we just can't remember every single bit of it? What's going to happen?
Don't worry about that. Because, here's what's going to happen. As you go through the education, the things that needed to effectually work in you, they'll be in you. Yeah. It's not a matter of I got to remember a bunch of data. It's that you're going to be taught how to think in a certain way and how to live in a certain way. When those things effectually work in you, that's what will take place.